I think we can start now, Bu Yusnita.
All right, everyone, we are going to proceed and start our seminar today. Welcome, everyone, into our Research on Linguistics seminar series. This is Brown Bag Talk. Our session today will be a presentation that will be given by Dr. Cameron Thompson from Vistula University. Before we start the session, everyone, we will have a welcoming speech from the head of our department, Bapak Suharyadi. Bapak Suharyadi.
All right, thank you so much, Ibu Yusnita. So Dr. Thompson, we call it Ibu, yeah, to address she in Indonesia. Yeah, so this is a new word for you, I think.
It is. It is.
Yeah. So thank you so much for joining, participating in this very good time, very good moment for every one of us. So allow me to address the people in the Zoom, the honorable keynote speaker. We have Dr. Cameron Thompson from Vistula University. Thank you so much for being a part of our Department of English, Faculty of Letters, Universitas Negeri Malang. Yeah, and it must be your first time meeting us or seeing everybody here.
It is. It is. Yeah. Yes, it's a pleasure to be here. It's my very first time.
And also, thank you so much, Dr. Anna Kamen, the head of the English department, Vistula University, and we have done so many, emailings to organize to provide this brown bag talk, the collaboration between your department and our department. So thank you so much again and again. And I would like to thank many people here, of course, because this event will not be able to be organized well without any collaboration from your people and our people here in Indonesia. So the people we have is the head and members of research cluster. Yeah, we call it literature, and then also linguistic research cluster. And then we have the head, Ibu Nurenzia Januar, for the head of the linguistic research cluster. And then we also have Pak Kuku, the head of the research cluster of literature. And we have also many members over there. Thank you so much for helping us to organize this event. And of course, we have the secretary of the department. We have Ibu Ani Nunu over there. And it is also the first time for you to see her, right? Yes. And also thank you so much, the coordinator of the study program. We have Professor Yazid Bastomi. Thank you so much for coming, Pak Prof. We call Pak, to address the he. Yeah. All right, and then of course, we have some faculty members in our department joining this workshop. Thank you so much for joining us, and also all of the students of our department. Again and again, thank you so much for joining this workshop or brown bag talk, or maybe whatever the name. And then this workshop, this brown bag talk is the first for. The first time for us to have collaboration with Vistula, and I hope that this collaboration will continue, not only in 1 year, but also in the second year, or maybe 2 years, or 3 years, or 4 years. Yeah, I hope it will work not only this year, but also next year's. And I also hope that we will get a lot of benefits from this brown bag talk, maybe about linguistics, maybe about literature, of course, about your topic or your interest. I hope the student will get benefits from your ideas, your discussion too. So I have no more to say, I think. and maybe we will listen to your talk, and we will get a lot of benefits. So thank you so much for joining our Brown Bag Talk. Enjoy, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Suharyadi, for the warm welcome for all of us, as well as welcoming Dr. Cameron Thompson to our event this afternoon. Everybody, Dr. Cameron Thompson is an anthropologist and psychologist. His academic specialization is in the intersection of culture and moral development. For the past 10 years, he has worked internationally as a speaker and as a leadership training consultant. He is currently engaged in a multi-year personal project to bring new life to ancient lore through fresh English language translations and edition, which is forgotten or neglected. Also edition of forgotten and neglected primary source texts of Oriental Christian spirituality. Dr. Thompson's recent research has been in the semiotics of worldview and narrative identity construction and reconstruction. This is all very exciting to see the biography of Dr. Cameron Thompson. And I have read the abstract as well. It's all very exciting as well. In his presentation today, everyone, the presentation is entitled Semiotics and Fantastica, Self-Science, Identification, and Estrangement. What an exciting title as well. So in this presentation, we will be learning about how we can understand fiction in Neverending Story, the book version. Dr. Thompson will elaborate more in his presentation. Dr. Thompson.
Thank you. All right. I'm going to share my the slides here. Let's get that started. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. And as you mentioned, the title of my talk today, Semiotics and Fantastica, Self-Science, Identification, and Estrangement, is the best way I could summarize what might be, we could say we take a, the succinct approach. This is the formal register, speaking the formal register. But I want that to be bracketed, if you will, with alongside, let's call the more informal register or personal approach or colloquial way of thinking about the subject matter. And this is following in a tradition, perhaps you could say within American English literature, and I'll be drawing especially upon the novelist, psychiatrist turned novelist Walker Percy from the American South, with the subtitle or the alternative title being The Childlike Empress Gets a Name, Why Signs Make a World, Why You're Bored on a Thursday Afternoon, and What the One Has to Do with the Other. Now, in choosing that title, it's entirely incidental that this happens to be a Thursday afternoon for those of you in Indonesia. It was not intentional from the very beginning, but reference from one of Walker Percy's novels. But what I'll be talking about today is the strange phenomenon of language, signs, that is, that communicate meaning as distinct from signals, as language as creator of world, as distinct from environment, and thereby its magical power to conjure up, to constitute, and ultimately to transform the identity of a self distinct from a mere organism. The Neverending Story is what I'll be using as the touch point or the main sort of symbol of reference throughout this talk to illustrate some of these principles. Now, some of you may be familiar with the Neverending Story and some may not be. It was originally written in German by Michael Ende in the or I think in the early 1980s, it very quickly became popular in many languages around the world. Of course, naturally, also the English-speaking world, most especially once it was transformed into a movie in the late 80s, 1980s. And everybody of a certain generation is familiar with the movie, but maybe not the story. Nonetheless, the movie follows along the plot line of really the first half of the written story, the written book. But I'll describe some of the salient points as they're relevant to my talk today. The basic plot setup for the Neverending Story, well, really the frame for it, is that there's a boy who's reading a book, he enters a story, and he's stuck in it and he has trouble getting out of the story again. That's the original sort of frame intent of the author. But within the narrative, there is the boy reading this story. And so the story that he's reading is about a land called Fantastica. In fact, the story that he's reading himself is called The Neverending Story. And within Fantastica, there is the sort of regent of Fantastica, a semi-divine, daughter of heaven kind of figure, called the childlike empress. Now, the childlike empress has fallen ill, and none of the most wise physicians of the world are able to cure her. She's ill. Simultaneously, there is a sort of nothingness devouring the world of Fantastica. And somehow the one phenomenon is connected to the other. She's mortally ill. She's sick unto death, to reference Kierkegaard. And the world itself that she lives in, that is to say, the sub-world, relation to the boy whose name is Bastian, is eroding away into nothingness, not crumbling, not disappearing, and there's somehow something there left in its wake, but nothing is left. There's a real nothing, that same kind of darkness that you might think of when we think about what we're not seeing, when we're looking forward. What is behind us? We don't see blackness, we just don't see anything. So there's this sort of blindness, a real vacuity of existence. So this nothing is eating away at the land, at the world, and the childlike empress is sick. Throughout the course of the plot, as it develops, we discover that, or the hero within the story discovers for us that the only cure for the childlike empress and the only way to save the world is to give the childlike empress a new name. She needs a new name, or rather a name at all. For up until this point, which is rather late into the story, she's only been presented to us and to her people, as far as we, the reader, can see, only as a what, the childlike empress, a title, a descriptive title, but not a who. She's given as a role or an office, but not a person with a story and an identity. A name needs to be given to her by not just anybody, but someone from our world. The name has to be given to her by Bastian, the boy who's reading the story, who, as we discover through the course of the plot, by reading the story actually begins to participate in the story and in a way animate it. So she needs a new name. The culmination of the movie, really, as it completes, but in reality, the actual written book, this is about halfway through, there's a pivot point there, is that Bastian gives her a new name just as her world, the world of Fantastica, is being consumed by the nothing entirely. It crumbles apart to the very last bastion of safety and peace and, frankly, existence in her world, the ivory tower, which you see depicted in this lovely painting here. He gives her a name just as all of this crumbles away into the nothing, and all that remains is a luminous grain of dust. This small speck is all that remains of the Fantastican world. And in that moment, the two of them are brought together, and he transcends the world. He enters into her world, or she enters into our world. It's unclear. But in the giving of the name, then, now there's a breaching of worlds. There's an intersection where the one enters into another, and there's a fullness of being now held in the hands between the two between these two effectively children. But the key question is, why does she need to be given a name? Why does she need to be given a name? And this is something that she reveals to us in a dialogue as part of the crisis as it's coming to its apex, is that only the right name gives things their meaning. The wrong name makes everything unreal. That's what lies do. Because lies make something not merely different, they make them no thing. A lie doesn't make a thing a different kind of thing. It takes away its essence, its meaning, and makes it an unthing. Lies erase the meaning of the thing, and in doing so, create a vacuum of no thing, nothing in their wake. In the metaphysical, that is, this nothing begins to exist in the metaphysical and metaphorical space between the real meaning of the thing and the shell of its false meaning. Now, to dive into the scientific, if we will, perhaps more mechanical side of this poetic angle that we've been looking at so far, I want to dive into a brief primer on semiotics, the study of signs and their meaning, a la Walker Percy. Walker Percy was a mid to late 20th century novelist who began his career as a psychiatrist. His basic approach to his mission in life, to his story, was the realization that as a psychiatrist, the maladies of the modern Western world are best addressed not through psychotherapy, but rather through restorying things, through weaving novels, stories that can shape a world. And as a semiotist, as additionally a linguist and semiotician, he raises the question of the nature of the human person. And he says, where does one start with the theory of man if the theory of man as an organism in an environment doesn't work? There's something different about a human being that sets us apart from other creatures and other things, other organisms in the world. I'll explain that a little bit more detail in just a moment. He said, there's only one place to start. The place where man's singularity is there for all to see and cannot be called into question, even in this new age in which everything else, which he's referencing, the soul, godlikeness, religion, divinity, mind, self, all of these, where everything else is in dispute. And he says, that singularity is language. It's from his book, The Message in the Bottle. Now, in framing up the idea of language and this strange phenomenon, what it is, Walker Percy, essentially, he talks about, he sets out sort of the claim first and then explains how he arrives there. The claim essentially is that the human creature is a promiscuous sign user, for all we know, unique in at least this world, if not in the entire cosmos, but we know our own experience at least, is that we are compulsively meaning-making things, creatures that thrive, that can't but impart meaning to things. We give names gratuitously, prodigiously to everything that we encounter. In fact, this is the universal experience of young children. When they begin to speak, when they begin to learn, they immediately want to know, what do we call that? What is this called? What is that called? Is this one of those, or is this something else? We apply words and we want to be able to describe things. Why is that? Other things in the universe, and this is true of us also, although we exist at another level as well, the level of language, but prior to language or outside of language, we have what could be described as a series of dyadic relationships. And I would point you to diagram 1, where each entity, each being or thing in the cosmos, in the universe, is related to these other things in a dyadic way. There's a cause and effect relationship one way and or the other way. And for most organisms, diagram 4 here, within the universe, we would see there's the organism as a being, as a living creature, say the dog that lives across the street, in the apartment across the street from me, or the pigeon that was sitting on my windowsill this morning, is an organism in an environment, a complex environment that with which it has a number of dyadic relationships, stimulus and response relationships, even among other living creatures. And one famous study within the world of psychology and linguistics is, of course, B.F. Skinner and his study on the pigeons. He had pigeons, did an experiment training the pigeons essentially to push different colored buttons to get different kinds of rewards, say a certain kind of food. So the pigeon named Jack, you can see in diagram 6 down in the lower right corner, hungry Jack, the pigeon, having learned how to get food, is sort of one event. The next event is that the pigeon pecks a key marked a certain color. The other bird, Jill, the other pigeon in the cage, responds by looking for the right color on the button. Then she goes and pecks the same colored key as though they were communicating. You see, so this was set up as a study to show that the pigeons communicate. Then, the pigeon selects the right color and the food comes out. What Walker Percy points out is that even in this kind of scenario, and this is something that, goodness, what's the other philosopher's name? There's another linguist whose name is escaping me right now. He speaks especially about this. He's the one who developed the idea of the language acquisition device as something unique in the human creature, distinct from a kitten. A small cat, no matter how much you talk to a cat, it won't learn to speak. However, a human baby eventually becomes habituated. There's something different there going on. There's a meaning making function. There's a meaning making organ, if you will, within the human being. But with these pigeons, what we see is just, again, merely a series of dyadic events rather than this other phenomenon of language. So communication can happen in the trading of signals. One thing can signal to another. In fact, the fact that we're able to do this right now is facilitated by these machines that are amazingly able to signal to one another, even signal within themselves. It's the way the computer works. It's through these dyadic signaling. And hello? Okay. But language is a different kind of thing. What Walker Percy calls the delta factor is at play. This is what distinguishes a sign from a mere signal. And we can see the example of Helen Keller. If you're familiar with Helen Keller at all, she was a person who was essentially blind and deaf and mute, for all intents and purposes here, blind, deaf, and mute, and wasn't able to communicate. And she spent a certain period of her life living as, in some sense, like a mere organism in an environment, because she had no sign usage to impart meaning to things and communicate in the linguistic way with other people. At a certain point in her life, there was a pivotal moment where she had a tutor, a teacher, a guardian who was helping her, and she had her hands under the water. You may be familiar with this event because it became very famous, that the teacher was holding her hand under the water, showing her the sort of a modified sign language hand symbol to signify water. And she had known some of these signals prior, but they were just signals for her to say. You could make the sign or the signal in her hand where she can feel it for cake, and she would go and look for the cake, or for bed, and she would go to bed, at this dyadic level. But there was a moment of revelation, an epiphany, if you will, where she had her hands under the running water, and her teacher was putting into her hand the hand sign for water. And at that moment, and she recounts this later in life in her biography, that instantly something clicked finally, that the hand signal, W-A-T-E-R, as spelled out in her hand, didn't just signify water, but it meant water, that this cool, clear liquid that's running over my hands is water. And so we've got this linkage now. It's no longer merely two dyadic relationships. The subject, in this case, Helen Keller, and the sign, and then the subject and the thing being signified, but you've got a link between the two where that significance actually exists, takes on a life of its own. There's meaning there now. It's not merely a signal from one dyadic relationship to another, but the loop is closed. Now we've got what is called the delta factor. So when we introduce a sign, a word, a real word meaning, and not merely a signal, other new properties occur. other new properties appear. We have now relationship between once a sign user, a sign giver, and a sign receiver, I and you. And in between us stands the sign, the signifier, and the referent, the thing signified, the word, and the thing that the word means, doesn't just point to, but is somehow connected to. That's that bridge of meaning. And in this relationship between the sign utterer and the sign receiver, these are subject to such familiar variables that we might talk about as intersubjectivity, the I-thou relationship, but also depersonalization, the I-it relationship between the person and the thing being referred to in the third person. A particularly mysterious property is the relationship between the sign, the word, and the reference, that thing that is signified. This is expressed by the troublesome copula is. For instance, when Helen Keller said that the perceived liquid is water, it isn't just signified by or symbolized or signaled by water, it is water. There's this deeper connection. Another unique property of the sign user, of a special significance here, is that as soon as the sign user, the language maker, a language user, crosses this triadic threshold from merely dyadic relationships, from being merely an organism in an environment, into having this triadic sense of meaning and word usage, signs that create something beyond the things in the environment. For instance, this cup of water is a thing in my environment, right? Once we cross this threshold of language, now we enter not only an environment, we exist not only in an environment, but we enter a world. This is another plane of existence. The world of the sign user is not identical, it's not coterminous with our environment or the cosmos. So signs transcend an environment in that signs make a world. So we can have the things are around us all the time, whether I'm sitting here or whether a cat is sitting on the desk. We're both surrounded by the same environment. There's the computer in front of me, the desk before me, the glass of water here, from which I'm going to take a drink. These are all things and events in the environment. But in my ability to name them, to have a name myself, to have a relationship with other persons, which is where the language arises, is now to impart meaning to things. And there's a layer now that exists above and beyond the mere environment. As such, signs in making a world also give selfhood. It's not merely an animal self-consciousness of being in an environment and understanding, not necessarily understanding, so even the language begins to befuddle the distinction, but existing in an environment with these dyadic relationships. But when you have a world via language, you are able to have a self. So these two conjoined triadic events, the creation of a world and the thus constitution of selfhood, a sense of self-identity in its inchoate beginnings. These are events which always happen in any exchange of signs, whether in talk, in looking at a painting, in reading a novel, or in listening to music. This exchange between two persons, two language users, allows for such particular properties of the triadic event, of this triadic event, as understanding, but also misunderstanding, truth-telling, and also lying. The signal using organism has an environment, but the sign user has not only an environment, but also a world. So let's talk for a moment about this idea of estrangement. How is it that a self can feel like a stranger to his or her own self? Because this is in part one of the perils that comes from having a world and not merely an environment, is that the world as it transcends the environment is in a space other than merely the environment, what we might call the immanent. The world in its act of transcendence, transcends the environment. And in that way, a self constituted in the same moment as the world in which that self exists can become estranged from the environment. That is to say, to be in a transcendent mode, a transcendent experience of self. Likewise, there's moments in quotidian life where a self, a person, may find themselves in an immanent mode, stuck in an immanent frame, and thus estranged from their world, or at least estranged from a world that perhaps for them existed, but no longer exists in its fullness, or no longer is coherent. There's a disconnectedness, a disharmony between the self and the world that for some reason, that self, that I, feels that should exist. And these are very strange moments that are fascinating to delve into in depth. So the psychological phenomenon that's there and how language plays a role in that. But I just want to tie it, give a nod to it and tie into a deeper sense of language and its connection to our self-identity, is to harken back to what the childlike empress said. Why was it that the childlike empress in Fantastica needs a name? Because only the right name gives things and beings their reality. A wrong name makes everything unreal. That's what lies do. And so we tend to find ourselves, especially in our modern world perhaps, often or increasingly estranged from ourselves. What does this mean? This is not something that has a very clear answer, but is a question we should ask. Why do we, in our advancements, technological advancements that we've had over the last century, know more and more about the material environment about us, but we seem to know less and less about ourselves? Is there an inverse relationship to this? What is the role of language? What is the role of meaning? And this should bring us back to a fundamental question of, who am I? And if I have this problematic estrangement, or this problematic re-entry into a coherent world, how do I re-enter the world? How ought I to re-enter the world? Is there, as many people would ask, is there even a world to re-enter? And why does it seem to elude me? I would at least propose these considerations: that our self-identity is narrative. As human beings, we carry our own, the way we carry our sense of self is in a narrative form. It is storied. That is, even if unconsciously and inarticulately, as is often the case, we carry these stories about in us, the story of who I am. We carry them about in us in a narrative way. That's the substance of how they exist within our heart, our mind. And we continue to tell these stories through the choices and actions that we do in life. It's the fundamental lens through which we view the world, but also through which we participate in the world around us, or rather our environment, as mediated by a world, however incomplete and or fragmented that world may be. Moreover, the ethicist Alistair McIntyre has pointed out, we only make our choices and decisions fundamentally predicated on what story or stories we believe ourselves to be a part of. That is to say, what world, fragmented or whole, do we believe that we inhabit, is the determining factor in the choices and decisions we make in life. And even, I would argue, and so would Wittgenstein, would argue that even determines what world or what aspects, what concepts are even accessible to us, as determined by our language and the ability to give name to these things. So we may find, many people do, sometimes, that the story of who we are doesn't fit or no longer fits with reality such as it is, or that we choose to begin to reshape our own narrative, to reweave the threads of our story, of our identity. This, along with other things like societal crises, natural disaster, war, and sex, can precipitate a conflictual or problematic re-entry into the world. A world no longer precisely as it was or as we remember it. For we, our own story, is no longer precisely, our story, our identity is no longer precisely as it was. So how does a re-story itself re-enter the world? Especially if, like Bastian in the Neverending Story, the world that I try to enter has become for me naught but a luminous grain of dust. Or is it the case that that such a world is in need rather of recreating and not only of re-entering? If the question is not merely that there's an existent world in which we need to re-enter to feel whole again, then perhaps the world needs recreating. Are we, each one of us, perhaps like Bastian, charged with the task of rebuilding a fragmented world? If so, we must relearn the magic of words, the magic to create a coherent world that transcends our mere environment. Indeed, we cannot but live in a world of some sort, as I've mentioned, although the worlds that we often now inhabit be fragmented and discontinuous. We can step, like the image on the slide here, from one story into another. I would just take a moment to point this out for those who are able to see visually. There's a boy standing over a dragon, beside the head of a dragon. And he's got a sword and a shield. He's playing a knight. And the forest behind him, as you'll see, as it progresses to the right, the trees gradually transform into the edge of a book of books. It's like all of a sudden being like a bookshelf. And some of his companions are already fleeing the dragon into the dark wood, but the dark wood is itself actually a series of other stories that they can enter into. And perhaps there's something for us here in this image, communicated by this sign. So to recreate the world anew, we may find that we are charged with the task of rebuilding a fragmented world. If this is the case, we need to learn from the lessons that Bastian undergoes in the second half of the book, not mentioned at all in the movie, of the Neverending Story. The lessons that Bastian undergoes we must learn from in order to re-become ourselves. Throughout the course of the Neverending Story, Bastian somehow becomes the protagonist himself of the sub-story that he himself is reading. There's a hero named Atreyu. He becomes Atreyu in many ways, symbolically, but in the deep sense of this word symbolism, or rather the meaning or identity of Atreyu in the story, and the meaning and identity of Bastian, the boy reading the story, become the same thing. Atreyu's true self is this worldly Bastian, and Bastian thus is Atreyu in the same way this cool, clear liquid is water. We're introduced to that peculiar copula is. What does this mean then for us? And what is the role of story and narrative? One interesting etymological point is that there is a magic to stories it's written into the very English language itself, in the realization that the word spell, as in a magical spell, spell is the Old English word, the Anglo-Saxon term, even throughout the Proto-Germanic languages, to refer to a story, a tale, a history, or a narrative. And thus there's this deep connection in our consciousness of stories, tales, narratives being magic. To weave a magical spell is the same thing as to tell a story. In The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, there's a creature called an Ent. His name is Treebeard in our tongue, in the common tongue. The term Ent itself connotes the Greco-Roman word for being. He reveals to us that the name of an Ent, that is to say, the name of a being, is a story the name is a story, and as it is a story that is growing all the time with us as we live, and perhaps beyond. And so a name is in itself a never-ending story, and as a story is thus, to follow the Old English, a spell. I want to conclude here with an illustration of this by so it illustrates this phenomenon that is a name then is a sign, and it means the bearer of the sign. As the English poet Gerard Manley Hopkins says in his poem, commonly known by the title as Kingfishers Catch Fire, each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being indoors each one dwells, selves goes itself, myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. Or to quote Gandalf, I am Gandalf, and Gandalf means me. So I will conclude by anticipating the question and answer session by asking the first question. What is your name? What is your story? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cameron Thompson. Everyone, please put up your emojis. For, let's give a round of applause for Dr. Thompson's presentation. Such a fascinating presentation, ended with an intriguing question for all of us about ourselves, about our identity. What is your name? What is your story? For some people, this might be relatable and touch to the deepest part of themselves, questioning identity, questioning their stories. We are all here with unfinished story, I guess, because we still have a probably, hopefully, a long way to go. Everyone, this is now time for us to have a question and answer session. This is a very good opportunity for all of us to discuss questions about ourselves, the signs, our identities, and estrangement with Dr. Thompson. If you have any question, please raise your hand and speak up to the Zoom room. Otherwise, you can also put your question in the chat box. We have one question popping up in the chat box, Dr. Thompson.
Okay.
This is one of our students. His name is Adam. He said he's actually curious about how an early human first makes meaning with their environment, and now how we all can be understood with alphabets, with terms that makes us signify environment around us. And in the civilization today, we have different symbols, different alphabets, different characters to signify a signified object that actually have the same concept on the first place. I hope you can understand the question here. Yeah. Yeah, and we'd appreciate your comment on this.
Sure, I'll take a stab at it because I discern in here two levels of the question. The first is how an early human being first makes meaning with the environment, and now can be understood, and then that grows. I would propose perhaps the image of a tree. You know, we might plant the seed of a tree or nut, and that's, you know, the first beginnings of a language, and then it gradually complexifies and grows, right? Our linguistic capacity, our meaning-making capacity. The question as to how the human being, you know, a baby human first makes meaning with their environment, you know, and acquires language. From my understanding of some of the psychological research, linguistic psychological research in this area, which I've only dabbled personally, is that even, actually there's been studies that indicate even in utero, so prior to birth, the audible, there's a familiarity to the tone and cadence of language that actually starts to be established at some point, even in the womb. with a young human being in the womb, even before they're born, to begin to recognize sounds, rhythms, tonal cadences, and that kind of thing with speech, which is very interesting because certainly that's something that we'd indicated somehow pre-conscious, right? So we enter into the world already with a orientation, a linguistic orientation, if you will. But what's interesting to note, I think, is that, and this is an area that I can speak more confidently in, is that there's never been any linguistic development that we're aware of, and philosophically it's very problematic to try and actually conceive of, apart from relationship to other selves. So we become a self through the usage of language, which demands or requires another person, another language user with whom we can communicate, even if we don't speak the same language, right? But another conscious self, another person, another subject who can say I, with whom we enter into relationship. That is to say, in order for sign usage to come into being, there needs to be both the sign giver and the sign receiver in communication with one another in that way. The second element of the question that I see is that why in civilization today we have different symbols to signify an object that actually have the same concept in the first place. I'm not entirely sure I understand, because there's a couple of different ways I could interpret that. And perhaps maybe that illustrates in itself, the context of the question.
I think,
but
sorry,
yeah,
I think I will.
Yes, Adam.
Please.
Yeah.
Makes me curious is about if we have an object such like you become an example in the first place, such as water. Water have a different understanding in every country. Like in Japanese, you understand water as mizu, and in Indonesia, you understand water as air. You have then in English you have an understanding of water as water, and that is, and from that understanding there are alphabet that that describe that object, and why that is become that way the object is different from each other actually. Why
Okay.
there is water, why there are air, why water, air, mizu, and something else that it's actually just water, but why there are so many differences?
Right. That's a good question. I mean, I think, at one level, there's a way in which the name applied to something could be other than it is in any given context. In fact, language evolves. The words for certain things evolve over time and change radically often, although there's always those very interesting words that remain persistent across millennia. But the idea that water could be called water, voda, aqua, or agua are contextual to the people that use that word, and it is constituted or evolved through the relationships in that place, the relationships of the people, the network of persons using this sign evolve the meaning to refer to this same substance as, by these different names. Now, the substance itself, we could say, has all these different names and many other names besides that we haven't invented yet, and many others that have been long forgotten. But for the people using it, the name for me, if I'm a native English speaker, the name for me is water. But if I'm a native Italian speaker, the name for me is aqua. And if I'm separate, think about this, the phenomenon of being separated from your homeland. Nobody else from your country of origin who speaks your language around you. And you hear it constantly. You say you move to America or something, you hear constantly the word water, water, water. You know this means water, and you come to identify that. And you think about it in a certain way. But then you're sitting on the subway, the metro, the underground, and all of a sudden you hear the word in your native tongue, somebody talking somewhere else on the car, and you pick it up and they say aqua, you know, if you're Italian or whatever your native tongue is, this word you haven't heard in so long, but it touches the very fiber of your being. That, what do you feel in that moment? I would say there's something there, and the answer lies somewhere in that phenomenon.
I guess that would relate a lot to our identity, how we identify ourselves to belonging to which group of culture in the world, I guess. So then once we are not, once we don't listen to this vocab lexical choices in quite a while, then estrangement would result, I would guess.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right.
I can
Thank
understand that as well.
I hope that answers your question, Adam, and thank you so much for your description, Dr. Thompson. Everyone, we still have chances to discuss more questions with Dr. Thompson. Again, if you have any question, please raise your hand, speak to the Zoom room. Otherwise, you can also put up your question in the chat box. I would also like to remind everyone that there's an attendance link to be filled in the chat box. We'd appreciate your help in filling in the attendance link. Thank you. What about estrangement itself, Dr. Thompson? How would you describe that in our modern world where it's actually very easy for us to create our own world, our own small circle, for example, both in real life and, let's say, virtual life. People also people can create their own community within online games, let's say, within social medias, let's say. We have even more chances actually to belong to a lot of different cultures. How does this estrangement then become relevant to our society today?
I think that's a very pertinent question to the to the moment that we've been living through, especially with this, last year's in different countries. It's played out in different ways, but where in some way or another we've all been forced to go entirely online for some long period of time. I think it's an interesting phenomenon because you've got, in some ways, with a virtual environment, the more you become immersed in it, you have the, at least hypothetically, the metaphysical possibility of a world that is not directly attached to an environment at all. An entirely virtual environment doesn't per se in itself exist as an environment. It's a world. My experience of what I'm doing is entirely within me, because at the end of the day, the actual environment is just this piece of metal and silicon and platinum that's sitting in front of me. And all of this is projected as being behind the screen, but there's really, what's there is, another desk, some other items that are there. It's not these people. And so that, as an interesting sort of philosophical, quandary in itself, seems to me to correlate, or to be related, I should say, to the observed phenomenon of people feeling more lonely, estranged, and anxious, more now than ever, in direct correlation to the amount of their life that is spent in this sort of virtual interface. There seems to be a strong correlation. The empirical evidence as I see it, is there to indicate some relationship. And from this point of view of what I've been discussing, I wonder if it would be perhaps precisely because there's a very real problematic re-entry into the world of the actual environment where I find myself. This is why so many people after the COVID pandemic and quarantines and lockdown have a hard time entering into relationship with other people again, or we're at least experience a sort of initial aversion to encountering one another.
Yeah, some people would call it a social phobia or something. Re-entry can be a challenge for us when pandemic's over and we get into the real world again, really.
Yeah, because our story has changed and we're trying to re-enter a world that is no longer as it was.
Yeah, we have to relearn everything the way we left off before the pandemic, right? All right.
Right, and to integrate our story as it now is too. and re-encounter people for the first time in some ways, re-encounter the world with fresh eyes.
Mm-hmm. All right, everybody, if you have any question, once again, feel free to raise your hand and pop your question. If we have a question popping up here in the chat box.
Okay.
How symbols or sign can be related to certain meaning and can be accepted by people? How is the process of all of these?
How does the process work? Of perhaps how do two people arrive at agreement on what the sign should be for something like this?
I would assume so, yeah. And in the bigger context, probably how would one society or one community would agree that we are going to call this A or B or C?
Okay. I think that gives the perennial question, from going back into ancient times, is what was the primeval language of humanity with the first man and woman? Even the ancient Romans were raising this question, try and take two twins. There's twin studies that are always done around this kind of thing, and so I think that's a question that's very hard to answer in its basic form, in the sense of, with two people who don't speak a language, how did they agree to start calling it thing, this thing water, or to call the cat a cat instead of something else? I mean, why not a flibbertigibbet, just to pick another vocable? And I think in large part that's convention, right? It's convention, and it's we see, of course, in language and the evolution of languages, there's many words, like the word horse, for instance, in English. It's actually onomatopoetic in its origin. Because the Proto-Germanic root of the English word horse is hros in its earlier Germanic form, and hros is just the sound that a horse makes.
And it becomes very different when it comes to Indonesia. It comes all very different. We have it kuda here, which is all very different from the onomatopoeic language that's that you have in Europe. Yeah.
And so you've got some things like that that function in that way, but other things like water, I mean, isn't particularly watery sounding, except by connotation to the English speaker. And so these things arise through convention or through onomatopoeia. There may be a natural resonance, we might say, to the cultural sensibilities, to the linguistic sensibilities that already exist. It's hard, perhaps impossible, to say ex nihilo how a word arises to be the word for a thing. But I think given the cultural context and relationship between the people and their environment, they choose to identify things, and those names may change over time. And of course, symbols within language, you can have periods of rapid transformation, rapid transition, and periods of slower transition, where language can change quite drastically in a short period of time, which we're seeing today, at least in English. That's the case, and I know other languages as well, as we adapt to new kinds of things, technology, the internet, computers.
Exactly, new things developing in life, hence new language coming up as well. It continues to develop, I guess, yeah. I hope it answers your question, Ibu Eni, or do you have any other point that you would like to say? We hope that she's happy with the answer. Oh, okay. She said thank you. Good. Of course.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Yeah.
If I could add one more, add one more thing to that, I think there's the same thing can be said about names, because people change. I mean, a person's life is only so long, and there's the phenomenon of people changing their name and what that signifies, and how do people come to that decision to agree to change the thing that means them, or maybe we change the thing that means
that was exactly one point that crossed my mind just now. I mean, we were born, we did not choose the name for ourselves. Our parents chose one for us. So how would we create a story for us if we did not make the decision to attach name to ourselves? So that's also a point to ponder, I guess.
Right. And certainly there are cultures and societies in the world where name change is a natural part of life as you go through transitions.
Also with the phenomena where people are changing genders, let's say, They also
Mhm.
changed their names, hence identity. So that might be related there as well. We have
Exactly.
another question here from Svetlana Penenko.
Okay.
Okay, Svetlana is asking, is there anywhere a study of changes in the meaning of sign or words, changes or shifts in the meaning of words in the past and in present days? And if we speak not about concrete words, but more abstract notions, how do we know that we understand Chaucer's or Shakespeare's works the way they were meant to be understood?
Yeah, there's this whole field of study of the transitions and it's called, broadly speaking, it's called philology, the evolution of the different words and their meanings and the way that words are used in different contexts. This is something that I come up against actually just recently. I was looking at I'm working on an edition from there's an English historian who published something about a little over a century ago, and the way even in 1920, well, so just 100 years ago, even in 1922, when he published this particular essay, he's using words in England in a certain way that's different than, at least in America, are used today, and in sort of international English. That I have to make footnotes in the word, for instance, disdain. Disdain, just to pick a word that I came across yesterday. Oftentimes in sort of colloquial parlance, native English speakers, at least from America, tend to use the word disdain to indicate an intense hatred. Loathing would be the more traditional word. That concept has evolved. They say disdain is this. But historically, as this particular historian writing the essay, in the essay that I saw yesterday, he uses the word disdain in the sense of meaning to give little account to pay no heed to overlook something. And so he's using this word in a different way. And so now that needs to be explained. So there's a whole field of study of this, I guess, to answer the question directly. And what's important then is the fundamental importance, especially for any translator of historical work, but of course this is true even in contemporary, is you need to have a thorough understanding of the world in which that sign user exists, the concepts that are available to them, and the connotations and the meanings that come with the usage of a particular word or another. In fact, there's a beautiful meditation on this in the recent J.R.R. Tolkien biopic movie, if you've seen it at all, where he is speaking with his philology professor, and he's explaining the meaning of the word oak, as in an oak tree. But to a certain person who lives in a certain village in England, the word oak has all this rich spiritual and cultural significance to him beyond the mere monosyllabic vocable. And it's important to understand that context to the greatest degree that we can, to see why somebody chooses one word or another and what they mean by it. And of course, how they pronounce the word in their own time. To pick Shakespeare, for instance, there's some fascinating studies that have been done based on we're comparing the original pronunciation versus our received pronunciation of the words, shifts the idioms that can be used, the jokes that are made, because one word sounds like another in their original usage, whereas they don't sound the same to us today if we were reading them off the page.
Very interesting. Once again, we can learn all of this in a study called philology, or actually more to the history and study of language. And probably as a part of linguistics, we also know word formation processes, I guess. So that's just a very small bits of how words are learned, and how in Indonesia ourselves we have a lot of new adaptation of words since the advent of internet. We have new words that we might not understand, or we might not have 10 years ago. The technical term of how we operate the internet, and how we talk about the software and the hardware of the computer, etc., and all of the systems, of course. This is one of the ways, I guess, to understand how language developed. Svetlana Penenko, do you have any more to say or to ask to Dr. Thompson? Okay, we really hope that she's happy with the answer.
Yeah.
Otherwise, please feel free to raise your hand and speak up to join our discussion. We'd appreciate that. All right, everyone. Any more questions while we have Dr. Thompson with us here? In our department, Dr. Thompson, we have 3 different streams: English language education and English language literature. Other than that, we also have linguistics. And
Okay.
we generally find your presentation is relevant to the 3 streams that we have here. So we are very thankful. We thank you for your availability, for your participation contribution to present here with us in our brown bag talk at this session. We really hope to have you again in the future to present with us so that we can learn from you again. Everyone, once again, one round of applause for Dr. Thompson. Please put up your emojis on your screen or clap your hands.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's wonderful.
Thank
It's been
you.
a pleasure. Thank you so much. I'm glad to be
Pleasure,
back.
pleasures are ours. Thank you so much, Dr. Thompson. So everyone, that marks the end of our discussion with Dr. Thompson today. Again, we are going to keep asking about our identity. We are going to bear in mind the question at the end of Dr. Thompson's presentation. What is your name? What is your story? Thank you so much. We will see you again at our next brown bag talk session. Thank you.
Maybe we can take a virtual picture.
Oh, sure.
Don't forget that.
Yeah.
If
Everyone, please
turn
open
on.
your camera.
Yes. Okay. Smile, everybody. 1, 2, 3. I have around 8 windows, so just bear with me. Yes, okay, I think I've captured everyone.
In case you're wondering, everyone, the recording of the presentation today will be available at English Department's YouTube channel.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. See you again.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good day, Dr. Thompson.
Thanks, Dr. Thompson.
Thank you. You too.
Have a good
Bye.
day, everyone in Poland.
Yeah, have a good day.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Dr. Thompson.
Excuse me to
Have a
leave.
good day.
Should we stop the recording?
Yes.